an interesting process for me on a personal level. While I was homeless for the longest time, I did want to stop using. However, being in the situation of being in the street for almost 3 years, I didn't feel that I wanted to exist in any other way than finding a way to numb what was going on around me. So I continued to use. When I got housing through Pathways, that's when it really started to click for me, and that's where, the interesting thing about Housing First for me comes into play, was not having that stipulation.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning into Narcotica. I'm Zachary Siegel, broadcasting from Chicago, Illinois. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic sparking a lot of policy discussions in communities that have been hard hit by the overdose crisis. We're talking places on the East Coast where illicit fentanyls are taking over the heroin supply. These powerful synthetic analogs of fentanyl are making an endemic problem even worse: housing and homelessness. Today, we've got Chris and Troy on the line and some special guests in the Housing First movement who we'll introduce in just a second.
Troy here. You may be wondering why we're talking about housing on a show about drugs, but this is why covering drug policy is so important. It intersects with so many different things in society, such as science, mental health, criminal justice, reproductive autonomy, and in this case, housing. We're going to get into that because this connection actually does make a lot of sense. Drugs can determine whether you're eligible to receive subsidized housing. Drug use can be a way to self-medicate the trauma of having unstable housing. And there's really no downplaying the related anxiety and mental health issues from not feeling like you have a safe place to sleep at night. And there's perhaps no better illustration of how, frankly, fucked up things have gotten over the years than Kensington, Philadelphia, where our very own Chris Moraff has been deeply embedded in the user community. In Kensington, the overdose crisis and housing go hand in hand. Chris, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, guys. It's nice to be back on, and I'd like to thank Matt Tice of Pathways to Housing and Sarn Wilson, who's a participant in that program, for being here with me today. Kensington is no better place than to demonstrate how policy, often good-intentioned policy, can turn a bad problem even worse. And I've watched that happen over the past couple of years, and I've watched the organizers, dedicated people like Matt and others in the community that have stepped up to try to correct some of these wrongs and mitigate some of the harms. The closure of 4 homeless encampments in particular this year, during one of the coldest winters we've had, created a need for low-barrier emergency housing for hundreds of people displaced by these policy decisions that are often made by people who've never so much as set foot in the camps. While city workers fanned out to meet the need, and they were eager to trumpet their successes, and credit where credit is due, they made some. The truth is that many people don't use city shelters because they're just not conducive to people that are active drug users. For instance, there's a policy that no syringes are allowed inside. So it's a counterintuitive policy if you're trying to promote harm reduction and use new syringes every time to tell somebody to throw out their syringes if they want to come in. So I've watched as people have stepped up to try to meet that donut hole of people that have fallen through this crisis and are homeless and can't benefit from city-run agencies, So one of the first things that happened was we had some respite centers open as these camps closed. But Pathways to Housing has been around for a decade, and they've been dealing with this population for a while. And Matt and his crew stepped in, and over the past 10 years in their existence, they've gone from housing 100 people, or roughly, to more than 400 now in single occupancy apartments. And Matt and Sarn are here to talk about what that experience has been like. And so thanks for being on the show, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
So I guess I'd start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the history of Pathways, what its original mission was, and how that mission has evolved as this crisis has evolved.
Sure, yeah. So the Housing First model in itself is designed to specifically help individuals who have been on the street really the longest. We're trying to target people who have been out the longest and who have the most significant level of need and the most amount of barriers, because more traditional systems, the types of things as you had mentioned earlier, kind of have the expectation that you have to earn your housing. You have to show that you're worthy of housing. Our whole idea is housing is a human right, and we should be able to start with that basic need, and everything else is going to flow from that point. And so a lot of times when we meet somebody, they look at us with disbelief. Sarn and I were talking about that a little bit, as though there's no way that could be true. And we don't have the expectation or the precondition that you must be abstinent, or you have to take psych meds. You have to do all of the other major things that typically are necessary in order to come into housing. Let's start there, and then you tell us what we need to do to help support you in more or less your recovery from homelessness and all of the other things that come along with that. Anything else that you would say that, like, when you first came in, Sarn?
Sarn, how did you get engaged in Pathways to Housing?
For myself, I originally was introduced through Pathways due to the fact that I was living homeless in the streets of Center City. And I learned about Pathways through outreach workers. And initially, I was told, if you're interested in getting off the street, we're an organization that is here to help you and offer you housing. And basically, at that time, that's all I was looking for immediately was housing to get off the street. And like Matt had just said, I did look at them with disbelief, because there was no requirement to be clean or anything other than being homeless and needing housing at that time. So that's my introduction to Pathways.
I just wanted to ask one question. So Sarn, up until that point, were there always strings attached or certain conditions and requirements you had to meet to get housing?
My experience with that, and that I also heard through others, was that it was a long-term extended process to try to get housing, which wasn't even necessarily permanent. In some cases, it was just temporary. But there was usually a stipulation that you had to stop using illicit substances. You needed to be in some sort of therapy if you had mental health issues. And you had to prove in a very amount of steps that you were capable of living by yourself or on your own in one of their institutions.
According to someone else's definition, really.
According to somebody else's definition, definitely.
I'd like to quickly point out that we're sitting in Sarn's apartment right now. Thank you for the hospitality. And I'm sitting in a spotlessly clean living room with a piano in one corner, a TV on in front of us, a beautiful fish tank. And I have to say it's cleaner than I left my place today. So just want to get that message in there.
Yeah, Chris, I don't know if per government standards you are allowed to be housed based on the conditions you live in, sir.
It's true though. I don't know if we all would qualify to fit the expectations a lot of times to prove that we need to that we're allowed to have housing according to most of the other program expectations, or even coming into shelter. Like if you think about here in Philadelphia, for instance, what you need to come into shelter. Well, you got to make sure that, one, similar to what Chris was talking about, if you have syringes on you, for instance, you can't have that. You need to make sure that you have all of your medication on you, but then maybe some of your medication might get in the way, or maybe you don't have historically, in some situations, you may have needed ID, or maybe this one place is full, and then you now need to go someplace else, and you may or may not have transportation to get there. Anyway, like, coming back to the history on Pathways, when we first started, we were meeting with landlords and explaining this process, and we actually thought that a lot of people would really struggle with it, that the idea of a harm reduction based housing program would be something that we'd have to really sell, but that's not the case. People actually really want to work with us, and I think that it's a combo in between the kind of support and services that we've built as an agency, and also the relationships that we've developed with our participants, and it's really exciting to do that all within the lens of harm reduction at the same time. So one other thing that I would note too, in 2016, as we were really starting to see some huge overlap in between individuals that were on the street with both opioid use and homelessness, and neighborhoods like Kensington that were coming more and more into the spotlight, the city actually asked us if we could start a specific team that was dedicated to individuals who used opioids. And we thought that we could use the model specifically to consider that, but then also consider all of the other safety-related things and harm reduction approaches that might be slightly different, working with folks with severe or serious mental health conditions, or even other substance use backgrounds, and then support them coming into housing and keeping them stable there.
Is that Team 7?
So that was Team 7, and actually that was where Sarn came in, right?
My original team was Team 7.
Yeah.
And the guy in charge of that is the guy named Sean Westfall, who is probably am I correct? Is he still running? He was for some time? Or?
Sean is not. Sean may think that he runs the show, but Sean is a peer specialist.
Stepping out of like the sort of Kensington situation for a second, for listeners, can Matt or Sarn, can either of you describe like the basic concept of housing first? Like I know we've touched on a bunch of it already, but just to get like a clear definition of how housing first differs from other housing models out there.
So housing first in and of itself is primarily recognizing that we should not put any barriers, any kind of invented barriers to a person coming into their own independent living situation. And so not anything like that they must stop using drugs, that they have to take psych meds, that they have to abandon all of their property, anything like that. It also is all about empowering choice as much as possible. So that's Sarn's turtle making some noise in the background. But we really want them to inform how to best support the participants, or support their own process in coming into housing. It's not about we tell them that you must fit this specific treatment goal or recovery plan. No, they're going to tell us how we can help work that out. And then it's also really, really focused on community inclusion. So when you've been especially when you've been on the street for so long, you get cut off, you get isolated. And it's really hard to reestablish in maybe patterns that either you never had or that you need to rebuild. And so we work with folks and community resources that are not necessarily just based in our organization, but then trying to help find them what's important to you. What do you want to do? Do you want to work? Do you want to find family? Is it based on your own faith preferences? All of that. Any other thing that you would add in the definition, Sarn?
I feel like you pretty much covered that. The important thing that for myself was, like Matt had just said, was the no pre-requirements as far as using or not using illicit drugs, heroin, in my case. as far as not having, or as far as having the ability to plan out your journey with them. I call it my journey too, but what your goals are with once you get housing, what your mission is within that, and being able to play a big part in that decision making, which I've found wasn't offered in hardly any other place that I had been to previously or looked into. And also, like Matt has just said, the community aspect, outreach aspect of it, where the resources are, if they're not immediately in the assistance pathways, they will, I found, find you what you need, or help you find, or guide you in the direction that you needed to go or desire to go. As far as that is concerned.
But it was also us coming to you. It wasn't about like you must come to our space and like you have to follow what
Your
A plus
criteria,
B
right?
plus C is equals C. Yeah, right.
Precisely. That made a huge difference as far as that goes. Yeah, but I mean, for me personally, I think it's a tremendous program. An idea or model, if you want to commit it as a model, the housing first.
So getting down to brass tacks here, where does your funding come from? And, I mean, we know that the federal government, for instance, has had some pretty hard lines regarding drug use and subsidized housing. Are you privately funded, city funded, a mixture?
No, I mean, there's a combo. I mean, we get it where we can get it, but our housing is also, it's actually paid for by HUD. And HUD has made some shifts over the last few years where housing first is really one of their main priorities. And their more traditional programs have really struggled with that. I actually hear a lot of times, and when I go talk to other housing providers, some of them really hate housing first because they feel like, well, how can you just give somebody housing, or they haven't shown that they're ready to do this thing. But honestly, our federal government has actually made a shift to prioritize housing first. And one of the big reasons why is because it works. It honestly keeps people in housing. And beyond even just like the dignity of it and recognizing that people have every right to be in their place on their own, but it actually also is cheaper on local systems, and that's true too. Like housing a person is way cheaper than keeping someone on the street. The amount of times that they're going to be hitting emergency departments or getting overlap with the forensic systems or all of these other areas, inpatient treatment or all of that is way more expensive than a person being in their own place. And what we also do make sure that we're doing is that we're wrapping around multidisciplinary supports. So that can also include peer support. It includes nurses. It includes psychiatrists, all of those things when a person is ready and what they want to engage with.
So to get public support for this kind of idea, it's kind of going to require a cultural shift, right? You just talked about how some people feel like you have to earn housing, and that's kind of an ideal that is embedded in our culture. Like you say that housing is a right. Well, maybe you can explain why it is a right, because I don't think that really registers with some people. I think that there's this fear that if you just provide a place for people to live, regardless of where they are, whether they're sober or not, that they're just going to use that opportunity to get high all the time and never be a productive member of society. But that's not really true. I think that we can talk about this a little more, about how a lot of drug use is a symptom of not having adequate housing, right?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I was talking with another participant who was telling me that when she first came in, she was like, "Oh, great! This is an opportunity where I can use, or I can do my thing." But then when they got in and they were like, "Wow, this is really great. It's really good to be stable, to feel relaxed." There was some really amazing and restorative things that happened in that person's life. But it was not because we forced that or that we said that you have to comply to XYZ. It was because that was what they wanted to do themselves. So, it's hard to say like how we can make a complete system change. The thing that I really do like about our kind of housing first, which is actually scattered site independent housing. So we work with independent landlords across the whole city, and so there's not one building that's where the folks that are coming out of homelessness are. They have the right to anonymity. Sarn's place is a row home in the middle of the block. And he gets to come home and do his thing, but it's not that big building where you know that they did zoning and they did all of that. It's a way to fight back against kind of that NIMBYism.
You were talking about how like the federal government is moving more toward a housing first model, and so there was recently like this exchange between AOC and Ben Carson. So Ben Carson, he's the current Housing and Urban Development Secretary, and it's worth mentioning this guy has zero background in housing policy. He's like a neurosurgeon or something. But so AOC mentioned that there's this old quote one strike rule, which is like a 1990s sort of war on drugs kind of just like tough on crime kind of liberalism stuff. And so, like in this exchange with between AOC and Ben Carson, like she sort of got him to say like, hey, that kind of one strike rule actually, like, we should be much more flexible around that kind of thing. And like, I just want to know, like, has that like gone anywhere? Like if they signal at the federal level that they're like wanting to be more flexible around those kind of rules, like, Sarn, do you notice that? And Matt, do you notice that?
I really honestly can't say as far as I haven't taken notice of that. But what I was going to say though, with the housing first and the importance of it, for like Matt had stated, of coming out of homelessness and having a place. I really feel like where I live now is my home, whereas a couple years ago I was calling a box my home, and not that I was okay with it, but I'm really proud and glad to come back to this apartment that I was blessed to get through Pathways. And part of that is because it isn't like an institutional looking place. It's not, nobody knows on the block unless I tell them anything about me, just as anybody else that's living anywhere. So for me, that makes a big difference as far as my coming and going. But maybe Matt knows more about the...
Well, I would say that it's hard when we come in, even just the idea of defining homelessness, because there's the current definition that we use in the United States. It comes primarily from HUD. And so, especially if we're talking about chronic homelessness of primarily the people that we serve through Pathways to Housing. So you have to have been on the street for a year. It actually has to be documented in you. So you have to have generally things like outreach contacts. And then if we think about a place like Kensington, for instance, until pretty recently, outreach wasn't going into Kensington. And so then to define someone's eligibility for services based on whether or not a person was seeing them and then writing down that, like, yeah, you're actually here, that's pretty messed up. And so the good thing is that the city has shifted, and we've seen that they have tried to help bring a lot more focus. But those at the margins, or if you don't want to be seen, or you're really trying to avoid it, or you're dealing with some significant mental health symptoms, or all of that stuff, you're going to fly under the radar. And so there's the advocates and the folks who are trying to work for them. They've got to be really, really assertive and fight to help bring those people into the fold and utilize things like Housing First, where it's as low barrier as possible.
Let's talk about the importance of building community. in this kind of situation. I think one of the ways that supervised consumption sites are effective, for listeners, that's a room where you can go and shoot up drugs under the supervision of a medical staff, so that if you overdose, you can be revived. That's just like you have the syringe exchange, you get the needles, and then you have a place you can use them, and then you have a place you can kind of hang out, and then you have housing. Like building up this kind of community is really important for people's health.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't really recover if you're on the street. Like when I'm saying recover, like that, you can't heal your body if you've got a bunch of wounds, or you don't have a place to get clean shoes, or you can't wash your hands, you can't do any of that stuff. Right now it's probably, we just looked, it was like 103 degrees outside. Your body's going to fall apart, and there's no chance for you to even be okay physically if you don't have a place to go inside, close the door, be secure. So we actually just recently signed on the amicus brief for supporting Safe House here in Philadelphia, along with a handful of other homeless services organizations, because of course, we recognize that they save lives, and we're just so tired of seeing our friends and the folks that we serve and connect with dying, and we want to do anything we can to help bring that forward.
I was just listening to the Crackdown, which is another great podcast out there, and they did a episode about housing in Vancouver, and they were talking about how people using drugs in single in SROs and single residency occupancies, basically they were saying like these are places where people can be isolated, and it's places where people can use drugs, overdose, and die, and it's not in a supervised space. And so in that episode they were talking about sort of like a one occupancy where there was like sort of a de facto person who was like the guy that had naloxone, and like everyone knew if not to use alone, but also in this residency, like if someone is overdosing, like, oh, go to this guy's room on the 3rd floor and he has naloxone. Like, is there anything like that going on in Philly housing?
There's not. I mean, one of the things that Sarn and I actually talked about is, we want to be thinking through whatever individualized overdose prevention safety plan is going to be most effective for a person when they move into housing. And Sarn, for instance, was talking about the idea is never use alone. Correct. Have somebody around, have naloxone on you. Do you want to say anything else about that, like when you were considering that?
Personally, for myself, as far as using a narcon, referred to as a narcon, and the being safe and safe using, before I decided to start taking or joining the MAT program, and I was still using drugs at that time, I didn't really think about that aspect of the drug, the using drug. Like, I didn't care at that point in time about whether I was going to be revived or anybody else was. The more I got into looking into starting the MAT program, which, by the way, where I go, we're prescribed. We can pick up a naloxone at any time at the pharmacy for free. So at this point in time, I think I pretty much have one in pretty much every room in my house, just in case I either happen to have somebody that came over that happened to be using or happened to overdose, but also to carry with me out in the street, because of, I was telling Matt the other day about an experience where law enforcement was actually, I overheard them trying to deny somebody Narcan. So at that point is when I decided to carry it with me all the time. And also, as far as using, I encourage anybody to not be by yourself. It just as far, and that's something I learned at Pathways. It was put into my head with the harm reduction. It was, don't be alone. So it's just something I incorporated into my life at this point in time, anyway.
So Matt, that brings us to like a kind of difficult subject, and that is that you did have some losses as some of these people that were caught up in the fentanyl crisis began coming in. First, how much of a spike was it, and what kind of reactions did you have as an organization to that?
Yeah, I mean, truthfully and very unfortunately, it's been a thing that we've dealt with really from the beginning. But it's like that. There's always risk in, especially a person coming from an area where they have folks around, and then they move into what potentially could be isolation, and also knowing that that's potentially can be a high risk point is it can be really scary. We did see some really frightening spikes at times, where we lost some folks for sure, like that they passed away, and it was extremely tragic. It was really hard on the community. It was hard on our staff. It was really difficult, and so what we've worked on trying to do is evolve our process. One of the things that we actually did is that we brought on Sean Westfall, our harm reduction peer specialist, and one of his main roles is to talk about those high risk points, to encourage as much harm reduction based strategies, and advise to all of our staff that everyone is all carrying naloxone, everyone is all talking about overdose prevention plans and safety plans from that individual perspective, but he's been able to help us kind of push that perspective forward. He actually came from working from a syringe exchange here in town, and has spent a lot of time with the rest of this community. What it's also required is figuring out how to help take care of community members who have lost somebody, and also our frontline staff who have been through the continual trauma of losing somebody, of coming into an apartment and finding someone. It is extremely hard in that sense. Someone that, it's different from if you have in an emergency room, you just meet that person there. We have long-term relationships. We've known people for years, and it's very, very hard.
Sarn, when you began living here as a user, did you come and use alone?
Thankfully, in this apartment, I haven't used. In my initial apartment, where prior to moving here, I think I did use, in recollection, once or twice by myself, but I was so petrified by that time because it had been put into my head, don't use alone. And so after those times, or in between, which was a short time, but after that, I did make sure that there was somebody around. Or I let them know, look, I'm going to be using, there is Narcan in my cupboard right there if something should happen to me or to them. So yeah, it's definitely something that's in my head right at all times, actually.
I think one of the other things too, though, is I had someone once talk to me about I'm struggling with this idea a little bit of like housing first, because I'm watching people that I care about a lot going into housing, and then this happens to them, and I think a little bit of their premise was, should we be putting them into the housing by themselves? Should they go in or is it better for them to stay in shelter, or is it better for them to stay on the street? And my reaction is, people have bodily autonomy. You have a right to your own self, and that's also one of the things that we're providing. We're giving you the opportunity with housing to take whatever step, whatever space is right for you. Very, very sadly and tragically, there are times when, unfortunately, because of the supply of drugs that are out there, people have lost their lives in the midst of that. But it's also, they wanted to be off the street. They wanted to have their own space. They did not, they weren't in an alley somewhere when that happened. I actually had a conversation with a woman once who she was really struggling with, it was kind of end of life for her. We were considering palliative care, and she was having a hard time going into a hospice. She was at the hospital and she didn't want to go there because she was like, I don't want to die homeless. And I said, we're going to hold on to your apartment. You will not die homeless. You will be a person who has your own place. And it was after that she then agreed to, peacefully go into a space where she could die with dignity. And that's another thing that we can also support. We're going to fight like hell to keep people alive. But we also want to recognize people's own rights and choices and dignity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like so amazing that there is groups like Pathways out there that isn't putting strings onto housing, is like, it just sounds like Troy was mentioning a minute ago, like housing is a right, just like how, I think for everyone here, or maybe those listening, like healthcare is also a right, like access to food is a right, and like all of these things are somehow being twisted as entitlements and privileges and bound up in like our sort of welfare system, and it's just like, at what point did we, did all these things become commodities and part of transactions? And it's just like, it's just like so amazing to hear that like you're all in Sarn's apartment hanging out right now. Like that is just how it should be.
So, in the context of what you were saying, first off, Matt, I know that, I'm thinking of one of your participants that was in jail for several months, and you maintained an apartment for her, and she was able to come out and return, and I think that's great. And in the broader context of some of the social services, the wraparound services that encompass this program, what was that process like for you? You come in as a drug user, and then what happens? You start gaining confidence,
It was a interesting process for me on a personal level. While I was homeless for the longest time, I did want to stop using. However, being in the situation of being in the street for almost 3 years, I didn't feel that I wanted to exist in any other way than finding a way to numb what was going on around me. So I continued to use. When I got housing through Pathways, that's when it really started to click for me. And that's where, the interesting thing about Housing First for me comes into play, was not having that stipulation. I found for myself that once I realized that I had this apartment and this security, I was then able to start that process that I wanted to, of no longer using. So I started a Suboxone program, and for me that has just been life-changing. But I really do believe, had I not gotten into Pathways, that I probably wouldn't have gone that route, just because of the lack of security and support. So where the program that I attend, it kind of works in the same way, that the group leaders and peer specialists and doctors all work with us to make a plan for what we want to do as far as our stopping the use of drugs. In my case, it was heroin on Suboxone. it's been it's an ongoing thing. I've been there a little over, almost coming up on 2 years, I believe, and it's been just amazing. But it's also because of that support and that from both pathways and my program, they kind of overlap.
And you were with you had actually done a methadone program before, and really kind of the parameters and the heavy like authoritarian perspective of that was hard, right?
That was difficult for me. I was on a methadone program for almost 7 years, and like I was saying to Matt the other day, I continually used, partly because I don't believe it was really what I wanted to do at that time, but it just didn't click with me. Whereas in this program that I'm in now has been working for me, and it's been life changing. And but once again, to me, it goes back to the whole housing first part. Though, had I not had housing, that it wouldn't have. I don't believe it would have happened. It did.
And I would note too, like for us, it is we by no means don't push any particular like this. It must be this or that. Like for some people, it's just strictly from working from a harm reduction perspective. We have to think about this in an inclusive umbrella. It's managed use. Other people, it's methadone maintenance. Other folks, I have actually started some Sublocade. It's Suboxone, it's Vivitrol, it's whatever is right for them, and then we help support them in other services. Additionally, it's also a lot of times we have some amazing nurses that are extremely assertive, getting out in the community and targeting folks, doing some incredible like street-based wound care and following up with people, chasing them down wherever they're at, and fighting tooth and nail with doctors in hospitals and ensuring that they're not going to stigmatize our people, or they're not going to withhold pain relief care just because they see them as as they're think that they're seeking meds or something.
It's also worth noting that not all of your participants are drug users.
Absolutely, yeah, completely.
What's the ratio?
So we have these two clinical teams that it's about 160 individuals that are that in order to be on them, they have to have opioid use, but the rest of the agency is a combo of, it could be other substances, but it also could be individuals with schizophrenia, or it could be major depression, it could be bipolar, anything that, a lot of times it's, we work with the folks that most other agencies either that they've kicked them out because they throw their hands up and they don't know what to do with them, or they haven't figured out a way to include them.
So let's talk about the broader context here and what the future is for this kind of model of housing. Is it spreading? Is it still really controversial? What's coming up?
I think in a lot of ways it still is controversial in some places. I presented to a handful of shelter providers and other people who were more traditional, and they kind of had the perspective that housing first is housing only. That's not the case. It can never just be this idea of we just shove a person in an apartment, wish them well, maybe come check on them in a few months and like hope that everything is good. It really is about helping to find out how to best support them.
Is there any other points that we missed?
I'd like to ask just one about the end game in terms of clients. Is there an end game for clients? I mean, is this indefinitely Sarn's apartment? What happens if he becomes employed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so this is permanent supportive housing. So we're there for people as long as they want to be in the program. We started almost 11 years ago, and I was just talking with somebody who came in with us back in 2008, and she's still in her place, and she wants to stay in that place. It's been really helpful for her to have the support, but she also, there's some ways where she's a lot more independent. And but then also for Sarn or anyone else, like if there's a point when they don't want our support anymore, by all means too, we can back off, or we can help them connect up to other services. We had someone more recently who was telling us that they wanted to reconnect with their kid, get custody back, and because we serve single adults, that person was not in our program anymore. But we helped them connect up into getting their own independent housing and reuniting with their child. And so really, it is about that person dictating their what's best for them.
Would you like to give a shout out to any other organizations that are working across the country that either serve maybe married folks or people that are models that you find replicable and worthy of?
Yeah, so like we're actually an affiliated agency of a couple other pathways to housings. There's one in Vermont and there's one in DC. There's the DESC in Seattle. They're doing some amazing work that's a combination of both scattered site and congregate housing. They're really inspiring in the scope and the scale of what they're doing. And it's really cool to see the adoption of housing first and advocates fighting for it hard, because it's an intuitive model. And while we focus on individuals, there are other great programs that are out there too to help make sure that we're including other folks too.
Yeah, this is amazing. I mean, I really hope that, like, obviously Housing First isn't like a brand new thing or something, but it still seems like there's a long way to go in replicating it and scaling it up. So, yeah, look out. I think that this is definitely going to be growing.
Thanks so much for coming on the program and having this conversation with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarn, for hosting us.
Thanks so much for sharing your story with us. That really means a lot.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hey, this is Aaron Ferguson, Narcotica co-producer. Thanks for listening to the show. Narcotica is an independent production by Troy Farah, Christopher Moraff, and Zachary Siegel. Our co-producer is myself, Aaron Ferguson, and I also make the opening music. Our theme music is by Glassboy. You can follow Narcotica on Twitter at NarcoCast or narcocast.com. If you liked what you heard and want to help us stay independent and ad-free, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/narcotica. Got an idea for a show, or just want to tell us something you think will blow our minds? We look forward to hearing from you. Shoot it on over to tips@narcocast.com. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and other places. That's all for this episode. Join us next time on Narcotica.